everybody, and welcome to this third and final presentation on regulatory best practices. This is on compliance, promotion, and enforcement, and it's aimed at environmental ministries and environmental regulators. And actually, anybody involved within the environmental regulatory chain within a state or region. So let me introduce myself. My name's Simon Bingham. I've been a regulator for 30 years. I have almost 20 years international experience. I've worked on projects in all 5 Eastern Partnership countries. I've developed regulatory systems like compliance assessment. Yeah, I'm here to take you through this presentation. So without any further ado, let's get on. So the topics that we're going to cover in this presentation, it's compliance promotion, enforcement, regulatory problem solving, and I'm going to detail some further resources where, should you wish to find out some extra information or do some research, you should find sources of information there. So the first topic is on compliance promotion, and we're going to jump straight into some best practice, good practice. So this is a web tool called NetRegs. It's available on netregs.org.uk. And it's a partnership between the Scottish and Northern Irish Environment Agencies. So it's 2 different organizations, environmental organizations with slightly different environmental regulations, but working together on a common platform. So NetRegs is a free tailored online tool that offers environmental guidance for businesses, mostly small or medium-sized enterprises. It has been going for more than 20 years and has a small dedicated team of permanently staffed individuals who are running this. So though this is run by 2 environment agencies, it has its own branding and sits slightly outside of the environment agencies. And anyone using it is totally anonymous. There's no links back to the environment agencies. And what makes this a good system is a range of different aspects. Is partly you can search on business sectors. So my business is dry cleaner, my business is a garage or whatever. And you will get information on your sector or activity that's specifically tailored for you. Or if you wanted to know about specific environmental topics like discharging effluent or surface water, um, it will also be enables you to search via that function as well. It has tailored guidance for every activity, but it covers air pollution that would be particular to the activity. It covers information on permits and licenses that would be required. It gives you details on emergency response, etc., etc. It's quite comprehensive, but it is tailored. So if you notice at the top left-hand side of the box, it says this environmental guidance is for businesses that move passengers and freight using road vehicles. So it includes commercial vehicle operators, coach and bus services, couriers, taxi operations. So it's specific information aimed at them. And it also uses a range of different knowledge transfer methodologies. So e-learning tools, of which we're seeing more and more, things like MOOCs and Moodles being used around Europe to transfer information. It allows the operator to do some self-assessment to work out if they're compliant or whether they would need a, a permit. It would also allow them to get a newsletter, give new information, so a push service rather than just waiting for them to actually look at the system itself. And it also gives them video case studies. So the whole thing about compliance promotion is that it's trying to achieve direct means of compliance assurance without a direct intervention. So what this means is it's not about going on site. It's not about necessarily doing environmental monitoring. It's about using other tools and techniques to actually help the regulated community comply with their requirements. This next example of good practice is about environmental management systems. We know that sites, operators, companies that have adopted an environmental management system should have the control mechanisms in place to understand when they have a non-compliance and rectify that non-compliance. This has been recognized by many different organizations around the world as good practice. In the OECD, there are environmental regulators in Japan, Australia, and the USA that promote the use of environmental management systems. And in the EU, the Industrial Emissions Directive has criteria that are based within the risk criteria that reduce regulatory burden if sites within Industrial Emissions Directive have an EMAS EMS. So that's the European management system. So there are different reasons that, or different opportunities for regulators to promote the use of environment management systems. Some environmental regulators will also be the organizations responsible for assessing EMSs. But one of the things that they often do is promote the uptake of environmental management systems through reduce costs for operators. So, for instance, cheaper permits, cheaper subsistence fees. They can reduce regulatory burden, so increase the length of permit duration or reduce inspection frequency, all of which give a degree of earned autonomy for the operator by having an environmental management system. Specific example here in the EU is Malta, the Environment and Resources Authority, and they use EMS in several ways. They give a 50% reduction in annual charge for their large industrial processes if they have a EMS, and there's also a tiered reduction in risk score. So if you have an EMAS or ISO, environmental management system, you will get certain reduction in points in terms of how high your score is, which could reduce your inspection frequency. And if you have a in-house EMS, in-house to the regulated operator, they will also give a little reduction in points, not as much as EMAS or ISO, but still a further reduction, meaning that everybody who has a EMS gets some form of benefit from it through the regulatory system. One of the best examples I've seen of accessible communication comes from Australia. So the Queensland Government Department of Environment and Science and Innovation have a monthly newsletter, and this is sent out by email. It uses very simple language. It's very easy to read, and this brings together a range of different items, from changes to legislation, changes to procedures, change in charges, enforcement action updates against certain sites, links on consultations that the Queensland government are putting out. So it's by its nature of being very accessible, it means that the general public can also read and understand this, as well as regulators that don't have specific environmental expertise, and those of us who live on the other side of the planet. So enforcement. Enforcement comes in three principal categories, or certainly for environmental regulators, there's three principal categories that are open to us. Most of us will be aware of the administrative and criminal sides of law, but there's also civil law that we could potentially use. If we focus on the enforcement toolkit, this shows a mix of those three branches, three primary groupings of law, from administrative, criminal, and civil, all in a hierarchy of where we have an increasing use with the lowest risk, so the informal warning, and increasing severity as we go up this pyramid. So if we talk a little bit about these levels, enforcement starts at a very informal level. It starts with warning. It starts with that discussion that we have on site, or in the form of a letter saying that we've noticed something's wrong. We expect some form of redress and improvement. It then moves into a more formal level of fixed monetary penalties. These are fines that could be handed out by a regulator, normally in administrative law. It then moves up to variable fines. So instead of having a fixed value set in regulation, this allows a sliding amount, so it can potentially go from a relatively low amount to a high amount, depending on severity. So it's interesting, the blue ones are things that we can do with the license that are normally in the various bits of legislation associated with each regulatory regime. So formal notices, this could be a stop notice or a remediation notice, perhaps. Suspending parts of the license, or all of the license. So a useful ability, for instance, is in a landfill with non-compliance, is the ability to stop them accepting waste until they fix the pollution control aspects. This has the benefit of stopping them making money and until they fix the situation, or a full license revocation, which means stopping the license altogether. If you notice, criminal case and interdict, they're the two highest bits in terms of criminal law and civil law for interdict. A criminal case has a range of different options should it be accepted by firstly the prosecutor and then actually go to court. So the range of options here will be dependent on the legislation, but it could go from everything from total admonishment, a court warning, a court fine, or even imprisonment. Obviously, imprisonment is extremely serious, but there's no way of predicting that within what we send to the prosecutor. So I think that allows some flexibility in terms of where that sits. An interdict is a seldom used tool. It's about civil law, where you prevent a case in front of a judge and be after immediate cessation of a particular activity. and were the operator not to comply with that order, they would be in breach of contempt and could go straight into imprisonment. And that's for very serious cases, and it's something only a few regulators have ever used, but it is a potential option. The use of these options will depend on the behaviors of those that we regulate. I said in the last presentation that there's little point in serving a small fixed penalty notice on a criminal. They will either not pay it or pay it and continue on their activity and just see it as a minor inconvenience. So you need to move to higher levels of enforcement to deal with true criminal activity. Equally, if we were to seek to prosecute an environmental champion because they had an accident, that's unlikely to encourage them to continue going above and beyond compliance if we punish them so severely. So that there's the use of certain tools comes with certain behaviors, and it's about identifying which tools are most likely to work with each of these behaviors. There's an expectation that environmental regulators will have an enforcement strategy that sets out various expectations of when they will and won't use certain forms of enforcement, what their enforcement tools are. This supports consistency of approach. Like other things I've mentioned before, consistency does not mean uniformity. So having a strategy and a set of guidelines doesn't mean that in every circumstance you will necessarily get the same outcome because of things like the behavior of those that you regulate, the severity, the environmental impact, etc. But having a strategy helps support fairness and equity. It also helps deter non-compliance. It sets out perhaps some of the enforcement tools and approaches that you use. For instance, if you are able to use covert surveillance, you could include that in your enforcement strategy. It also, in being open and transparent, it helps build trust, and it reduces, importantly, the space for bribery and corruption because it has set out those expectations of what you as a regulator will do. What you often see is that many individual regulators have their own enforcement strategy, but I think best practice goes probably to the Dutch at the moment, who have an overarching environmental enforcement strategy, and this applies to the 29 environmental services, the 29 environment protection agencies. It covers municipalities, provinces, police, prosecutors, branches of the ministry, water boards, and specialist in investigation service. So potentially 500-600 different organizations are covered by this strategy. The strategy at the moment is just in Dutch, but I've just been told that it is about to be translated into English. So you get an opportunity to find that on the website. So some of the common issues that we see when we do country reviews is over-reliance on a limited number of enforcement tools. The primary one that we see is fixed monetary penalties. So sometimes we see that regulators would issue a fixed monetary penalty for every minor non-compliance that they find during a site inspection. So that could be the first minor non-compliance you find, they issue a penalty. It could be that for every single non-compliance they find, they issue a monetary penalty. And the outcome of this from an operator's perspective is that they just view this as environmental taxation. So that it's unlikely, if they're handed out so freely, that they will actually change behaviors, um, because they can almost expect that they will get a fine at every inspection. So using fines in a more targeted approach has been shown to work more effectively. I mean, the realization that criminal cases, for instance, take a lot of resource, the outcome can be uncertain. I think it is true, but equally a reliance on fines without supporting guidance on how to improve things or an opportunity to fix the issue is seen as not helpful by many operators. One of the things that we also see is that fines, both fixed monetary penalties and the variable monetary penalties, are fixed in legislation. So these are fixed at a specific time, and that often the value of the fine doesn't change with time. So as inflation increases, the fine stays the same, and it loses deterrence value. And such that in some instances we've seen that the fines are so small that they're unlikely to have any deterrence impact at all. There's various ways in which we can keep our fines live and keep them meaningful. One is to ensure that they track inflation by actually having that fixed in the legislation, or having them tied to some other amount that increases over time. So a good example is tying it to minimum monthly payment. So pay. So additional numbers of the minimum monthly income of individuals is actually quite a useful way of tying it. So as that minimum income increases with time, so will the size of the fines. So it's not just about ensuring that that fines stay sharp and making sure that they stay current and grow over time. It's ensuring all your enforcement tools stay sharp. So one of the things to do that is to look at your legislation, to review your legislation, to ensure that the various enforcement tools are up to date, that there is a full range of enforcement tools. There are some new enforcement tools that are being used in certain countries now that were not available in the past. That any values are kept up to date. That you use all your tools. So, for instance, if you never, as an organization, use criminal prosecution um, in any non-compliance situations, those that you regulate will know that and will understand that that's not an option that is likely to ever impact on them for environmental crime. So you have to use all your tools on a regular basis. One of the good practices when you carry out any enforcement activity is to communicate to the wider public that you've done that afterwards. There may be certain specifics about individual names that you can't publish, but as much information as you can would be seen as a good practice. So the enforcement chain is very, very key, and it changes from country to country. Some environmental regulators have to go to the police, who will collect evidence and take that to a prosecutor, who then takes it to a court. Many are able to go directly with the case to a prosecutor, and some, for instance, the Environment Agency in England, have their own prosecutors in-house and can go directly to a court. Because of the complexity of much of our legislation, the shorter the chain, the better. Is certainly what we've seen. It's true with any chain. The system is only as strong as its weakest link. So if you've got a particular body, such as the police or prosecutors, that you need to go through, and they're not interested in environmental cases, it will be difficult to get successful prosecution in front of a judge. Common issues that we see within the compliance, within the enforcement chain, is poor communication between the environmental regulators and the police or prosecutor. We always have to bear in mind that the police and prosecutors, in the vast majority of cases, do not deal specifically with environmental law. They will be dealing with a whole mix of activities, from murder, commercial fraud, etc. And we need to have very clear guidance on why something is non-compliant. We need to build our prosecution cases in a very clear way so that they can be understood by non-environmental professionals. So we need to enhance our communication between these organizations. This is a two-way thing. We should help them, and they should tell us what they require of us. There's also a lack of training in each area, from environmental regulator to prosecutor, and of course police in between, on environmental matters, environmental enforcement matters. So there's a need for training of all these players. So the Environmental Prosecutors Network, ENPE, have developed some guidance on sanctioning environmental crime. And in there, they identified that there was a need for specialization throughout the enforcement chain. So this is having environmental regulators with specialist enforcement knowledge, having police or prosecutors with specialist environmental regulatory knowledge as well, and even having judges with that knowledge is very beneficial. So one of the things from an environmental regulator perspective we can do is develop those skills in-house, so that we have specialists that we can call on to take our enforcement or significant enforcement cases to prosecutors, etc. So one of the important things we've seen in probably the last 10 and 15 years is a rise of cooperation and collaboration at an EU level between different networks involved in the compliance chain. So the Impel network is all about environmental regulators, so permitters, inspectors. NP is the prosecutors network. NV Crime is the police network. And the EU Forum of Judges for the Environment, or clearly the judges. And there is now joint projects between some of these networks. There's joint conferences, and this is all aimed at improving that security of that enforcement chain. So learning from each other, networking, and building on a foundation of best practice. There's a range of different technological opportunities around enforcement. Some of these we know are very much state specific, but covert surveillance is definitely one of those. There's quite a few of the EU countries now that are allowed similar levels of covert surveillance to the police, hidden cameras, unmarked vehicles, phone tapping, satellite and aerial surveillance. And these are used everything from stopping minor fly tipping to serious organized crime. What I'd also say is that there's an increasing use of partnership in this area, working directly with the police and with other regulators to achieve satisfactory outcomes. The next technological advance is the use of trackers. So the Life Smart Waste project, which is a EU Life funded project, looking specifically at smarter regulation of waste, came out with a variety of outputs, one of which was on the deployment of electronic tracking devices to detect and prevent waste crime. So these are small GPS trackers that are placed into often high value waste items like TVs or fridges or freezers, in things like waste disposal sites, and then they track to see where they end up. And again, this is state specific. There's, because of the rules on covert surveillance, some of these, many countries don't allow this, but some do. A good example of where this has been deployed recently is in Sweden. So the enforcement toolbox should not be seen as fixed. Just like any regulatory toolbox, there's lots of opportunities for us to improve the use of our enforcement tools, to consider how we can use tools that don't exist in one particular regime that could be adopted in another. So, for instance, if things that are used in waste, how could they be used in water regulation? It could also be that there are new tools emerging that aren't currently used within your country that could actually be adopted into your enforcement toolbox. So one of the areas that we've seen growing in the EU and wider afield is what we call an enforcement undertaking. So these are voluntary agreements between a regulator and a regulated entity, an operator, where there has been generally a significant non-compliance, but instead of seeking to go for a court case, the operator, the regulated entity, would volunteer to take part in an enforcement undertaking. So this is where they would volunteer to do remediation work, to give money for environmental charities, into an environmental fund, into other environmental projects. There's many examples around OECD countries, America, Canada, Australia, and the UK, but they're now also used in various EU countries, in Ireland, Netherlands, and Belgium. One of the things about an enforcement undertaking is the size of the monetary value is often significantly bigger than a criminal fine or an administrative fine would ever be, sometimes into the million euro level. Another thing that the NP network identified, another issue, is that both the criminal and administrative sanctioning tracks, the two principal branches of law that we use, should allow for punitive and remedial sanctioning. And what you find is that there's little or limited enforcement tools that actually work towards remedial sanctioning. And that most environmental regulators find it easier to go for punitive tools. One of the growing areas within the EU is increased use of the Environmental Liability Directive for redress. So looking at environmental incidences, significant non-compliances, where there is actual environmental damage, and then seeking to recover costs and remediation. The Commission produced guidelines on what is the scope of environmental damage in 2021, and this is a really useful document for understanding the basis of the directive. It's all based on polluter pays directives, or polluter pays principle, rather. So when a incident occurs, when damage occurs, the person who or organization that caused that damage should pay for the remediation. Okay. The next topic is regulatory problem solving. I think traditionally many regulators would use inspections and a few enforcement tools, and think that is particularly that in terms of tools. They wouldn't look outside of that. The fact that some environmental regulators have a basis of almost 150 years of based on predecessor organizations of regulating using fines and inspections show that there is a need to actually sometimes use some other tools as well. And that includes things like compliance promotion and other monitoring tools. But there's now other ways of looking at particular problems. So this diagram, this example, comes from PBL, which is the Dutch Environment Agency in the Netherlands. And it's showing just concentrations within the Dutch food chain. How I'm going to describe it is not how it was originally designed, but I'll let you see through this. So from left to right, there's different individuals, different organizations in this food chain. It starts with food production with 65,000 farmers who take that food, that produce, turn it into food in 6,500 manufacturers who sell it to 1,500 suppliers whose products are bought by 5 different large purchasing companies who then sell that on to 25 different supermarket chains who have 4,400 branches in the Netherlands. And there are 7 million shoppers that go to those stores, and they take their food home to 16.7 million consumers. With new regulation that, for instance, was going to target pesticide use, our traditional approach as a regulator would be to look at the farmers. So we would think about perhaps doing inspections of those farms that use the various materials that we want to regulate. So 65,000 farms. Or we would seek to influence those shoppers and consumers through, for instance, buying organic foods through telemarketing or something like that. By looking at this supply chain, what we can see is that there are 2 points in this chain where there are very small numbers. So there's 5 purchasing companies and 25 supermarket chains. It would be much easier to target an intervention at the 5 or 25 rather than the 65,000. No environmental regulator is going to have the resource to inspect 65,000 farmers if they weren't already inspecting them. Where there could be the opportunity to look at how you would persuade or regulate the purchasing companies or supermarket chains, and that's just a different way of looking at it. So from a policy design perspective, using a situation like this and looking at the players involved in the chain helps you decide what your potential tools of intervention are going to be. It may be that you still require some degree of inspection and some degree of education, but it could be that you could actually use a lot less resource to get a better outcome. So we've already seen this slide, and this is predominantly looking at behaviors, but there's one of these that isn't really a behavior, and that's the under-resourced here near the center. What we see is a growing trend of the under-resourced are increasing and will increase further under new constraints such as climate change or the circular economy. And our toolkit for how we deal with the under-resource is largely underdeveloped. And as this will be a growing area over the next few years, we need to adapt accordingly. So an example here for the under-resource in a transition to a green or circular economy, it is looking at landfills. So our goal as environmental regulators is to avoid getting legacy sites and issues where a landfill would go perhaps bankrupt. So the EU landfill directive is driving different targets. It's putting reductions of municipal waste targets, dropping to 10% of all municipal waste by 2035. What is actually happening on the ground is we're seeing a reduction of waste to landfill, which means a reduction in profit of the landfill operators, making landfills decreasingly viable and increasingly more likely to close prematurely. So with the potential that landfill operators could realize that they're not going to make a profit, the most expensive part of running a landfill is closure and remediation. So there's the potential that landfill operators will leave before they do this. So one of the things that we need to do as regulators is help understand that, well, one, to understand that this is a potential to happen, but two, to actually see how we can support the operators to continue to operate to having a correct closure of the site. And this may be by ensuring we are flexible in terms of some of our enforcement. It's not saying that significant enforcement is not carried out where necessary, but perhaps reducing burden on minor non-compliance, focusing on major issues that have a longer term benefit. This could also be for organizations that have a high carbon use, such as coal power stations, how we help them to transition or to get to closure. There's various different examples of how this will be a growing problem for regulators. So the need to develop our regulatory toolkit to support them. We're also seeing a range of new approaches by regulators, so behavioral change, looking at green finance, looking at direct market intervention. And if we look at the principal branches of compliance assurance that we've been covering in this and the last presentation, monitoring, enforcement, and promotion, we see that these tools perhaps fit in promotion, but actually some of them may be on the edge of a new area. A good example where behavioral change is being used by a regulator is that the Rotterdam area that we talked about earlier with the e-noses in the monitoring presentation. They now have a behavioral change unit within their organization that is looking at how they can use behavioral change, nudge, etc., to help get the behaviors that they need by the regulated communities. So it is a growing area. We're seeing regulators directly supporting green and blended finance, looking to see how they can promote the use of finance to support primarily green technology. So there's lots of things going on in this area that some regulators are now involved in. So we've talked quite a bit in these three presentations about partnership working, about capacity building of institutions within a state, and from an environmental regulator trying to solve a regulatory problem, you can see how we can work with ministry, with partners, with organizations within the enforcement chain, and increasingly other regulators. So the use of or working in partnership with, for instance, transport regulators in dealing with a waste problem, where waste is carried by lorry, by ship, etc., using other regulators' powers to help achieve our environmental outcomes. There is an increasing willingness to work with the general public, NGOs, and directly with industry bodies, also to solve regulatory problems. Because some of these problems are so big, so systemic, it requires all of these players to work together. And something that was perhaps unheard of 15 years ago can be quite common nowadays in some regulatory organizations. There is a much greater use of data in almost all regulatory organizations. Regulators produce a high volume of data, especially those with laboratories and those receiving operator data returns. And actually getting the most out of this data can be difficult. What we're seeing is the growth in the use of data scientists in various regulatory organizations, and this enables us to look at the data that we already possess in different ways. Almost a decade ago, there was another EU Life Plus project called the Clear Info Project that had a range of environmental regulators and academic organizations that looked at how they could join up regulatory data with business information to identify environmental risks and opportunities. So one of the things that regulators see is that many operators will have multiple sites. What we don't often see is that many operators are owned by higher level organizations that control more and more different organizations. and those are controlled by higher level organizations or funds that have an impact on those sites potentially. One of one of the outcomes of this project was looking at how they could identify all those different layers, how they could identify all the single individual companies that are listed and owned by a large multinational, perhaps. And part of the reason for this is if you're trying to drive compliance at lots of individual sites, this takes quite a lot of resource to do this. When actually, if there's a higher parent level company, it may be easier to target resource at the parent level company to change behaviors on the ground. One of the probably best current areas of, I guess, big data and analytics is in the ILT, the Human Environment and Transport Inspectorate of the Netherlands. And they have a dedicated unit which are looking at big data and identifying significant problems and looking at methodologies to fix them. So one of the problems that they identified was that ships entering the Netherlands were using high sulfur content fuel, but they couldn't tell without sampling each vessel, which were large numbers of them, which vessels, which ships had this high sulfur content fuel. So one of the things that they did, remember this is a transport inspectorate as well as an environment inspectorate, was that they tied data in from other parts of the organization together. So they looked at the ship's manifest, and the ship's manifest details not only the cargo but which ports the ship has sailed to. So they need to give this manifest to the harbor they're sailing to in advance. What the analytics unit were able to do was cross-reference the ships and the ports that they knew had high sulfur content fuel that they were selling, and identify which ships to target. So it's a prioritization mechanism, effectively. And once they targeted ships, they were able to, for instance, fly drones through the stack emissions, through the smoke coming out the back of the ship, and identify if there were high sulfur content, and then target their enforcement accordingly. There's other examples of this in Europe, but this is probably one of the best, using data rather than direct sensors of every ship. So we talked about the enforcement toolkit. Just like the enforcement toolkit, where it may need to grow, the regulatory toolkit has the opportunity to grow. Is getting people involved within the institutional capacity of the member state to work in these various tools, be it communication in promotion, be it education of operators or education of the general public, inspection, using new technology. There's lots of different opportunities. And the saying is that n+1, when number is the number of tools that you need, where n is the number of tools you started with. So it effectively is ever growing. So we're on to the last short topic now. So this is looking at further resources. So we mentioned the OEC recommendation on the Council on Environmental Compliance Assurance. This sets out the basis of environmental compliance assurance. It gives useful direction at a institutional multi-level governance level, and it's really useful. One of the things I particularly find very useful, not just because I actually take part in some of them, but it is actually looking at country reviews. So two big sources of country reviews are the OECD and what they call the IRI, the Impel Review Initiative reports. And both of these reports have a slightly different style, but they include good practices and opportunities for development in them. And as a regulator in a different country, you can identify good practices that perhaps you could adopt in your own organization or seek to get further information on. The next is the OECD online library. There is a wealth of information on environmental compliance in this library. It's on a range of different issues, from SMEs to looking directly at the activities of regulators. Some really good material. The next one is about collaboration with the EU networks. So Impel, NP, UFIA, and to a certain extent NV Crime are all membership organizations, and some of these networks have the opportunity for countries from further afield than the EU to become either members, associated members, or observers. In some of them, their materials are all freely available online, and there's information that for many regulators amongst it, and clearly the wider enforcement chain. There's also other networks as well. The EU has a heads of EPAs network, where the heads of the various environment agencies from each state discuss key issues, and there's working groups underneath that. There's the Australian and New Zealand network called A-Alert, which has a lot of useful information available in English. And there's also the international network on environmental compliance and enforcement, which again has lots of information and materials that are freely available. So that is me. Again, I hope you found this presentation useful. This is the third and last in the series. So if you haven't caught up with the other two, I hope you do. Okay, thank you very much.